The Dwarfs, one of the game's very first factions, is a launch race for Warhammer 1. They're a beloved one, but they don't feel so great nowadays, do they? 7 whole years later, the Dwarfs have yet to really get an upgrade in a big way. The last FLC character, Thoric Ironbrow, brought a much-needed addition of runes and master runes as a mechanic, but that didn't fix some of the issues that the small, stalwart folk are facing. I've done almost this exact video a few years back, and a lot of what I brought up is still just as pertinent today as it was then, but even more so now that we know how the Chaos Dwarfs will play. I'm beyond hyped for the Chaos Dwarfs, but I was worried that the Chorfs would make the Dawi seem far less interesting by virtue of army roster alone. The Chorfs get everything the Dawi get, only with chaff infantry, flying beasts, skirmish cav, large centerpiece monsters, and multiple winds of magic. The counterpoint here is that the Dawi have amazing infantry, incredible casting in their non-winds of magic bound runes, and some great characters. But that doesn't change the fact that their campaign feels very flat by comparison to all the other races. And don't laugh, Empire fans, you're not that much better. You too, High Elf and Lizardman players, myself included in that list. So in this video, I'm going to go over some things I think could make for a far better experience playing the Dawi. You can jump ahead to any part of the video that interests you the most by using the chapters in both the timeline and the description. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitch as we are streaming a Boris Ursus legendary campaign. It's my second one ever. Currently, as we are also doing a giveaway for the new Chaos Dwarf DLC the day this video goes live at like 10 a.m. Pacific Standard. And if you intend on picking up the DLC ahead of time or on the day of, you can also use my affiliate link to help support the channel. But let's get started here on how we can make the Dwarfs a better faction. So to open up our discussion, we're going to talk about units. And the very first thing I'm going to propose is a change to the charge defense for the Dwarfs. So in the tabletop, Dwarfs had some special rules. They had Resolute, which increased their strength, Relentless, which helped with leadership, and Shield Wall, which helped with parry saves and stuff like that. Now, of course, we don't have all those things when it comes to the way that the game, the tabletop used them. But I think that the Dwarfs are not this stalwart wall of steel and 4 foot, 4.5 foot, 4 foot, whatever, Gromril and dwarf armor, right? They kind of feel a little too easy to push around. And here's what I'm thinking. And I think this can apply to both infantry and missile infantry in two different ways. Replace charge defense versus large versus, I don't know, dwarf relentlessness, dwarf resoluteness, dwarf shield wall, whatever it is, call it something. And what you do with that is you give charge defense versus large to the entire roster. And also, if they are braced, which that's how charge defense work, right? When bracing, it increases their unit mass. So now, when these guys are braced, they just become like an implacable wall. You cannot move them because it's just a bunch of dwarfs that are at your waist level and they just beat your center of gravity. Like you look at their mass, it's 150. To put this into perspective for you, Crypt Horrors are like 1,500. Ogres, I think, are like 1,150, depending on which ones you're looking at. So they just get bulldozed over. I think a way to kind of increase their punching power in infantry is make them truly like a defensive curtain and give them a mass bonus as a special army mechanic. Even further over, increase this into your missile infantry. Sure, yeah, they can maybe have the same dwarf resoluteness so they can't get bulldozed over as easily. But these are trained dwarfs that are centuries old or however old that they are. But Quarrelers don't feel any better than anything in the Empire roster, especially when I look at Thunderers, which razzes my box like no other. The Thunderer attack characteristic of 145 range and 17 missile strength is the exact same of a handgunner. Now, your stat line of being a combatant is better because that's the dwarf shtick, right? All the dwarf missile infantry are basically their normal infantry, but have the advantage of having a missile weapon. So that's your trade-off, I guess you could say. But being a Dwarf Thunderer doesn't feel any more significant than being a handgunner as far as your role goes of shooting things. And there's obviously the statement here about the current state of gunpowder across all factions in Warhammer 3. That it's really weird and buggy and finicky and they don't shoot what they're supposed to. That's a whole different bag of boots. That's not a term, but I'm sticking with it. So I would rather the Thunderers, maybe they had better reload skill because they're Thunderers and they're using Dwarfen gunpowder and they know it very well. Or maybe they've got to increase range because this is Dwarfen gunpowder. It shoots that little ball further. Or they have a higher missile strength. And I'm not saying like substantially, right? Like give it like 20 or 22. Make it feel like I'm fighting with some dwarfs that have some stake in the gunpowder that they gave to the Empire to learn how to use, right? I should feel like I actually am better at it because I'm playing a dwarf. And furthermore, like I'm talking about this new stance here, right? The dwarf resoluteness. What if the missile infantry for dwarfs, if they are braced or standing still, they get an increase to their reload time? A decrease to the reload time, right? They're better at reloading because it's okay, we're standing still and we're now going to just kind of shoot you apart. If I wheel and shoot into things, yeah, I'm now going to lose that bonus. And it could even be like Berserk where that bonus increases the longer I am staying still. That could be a really cool way to make the dwarf gun line and the dwarf infantry line that are just staying in one place and being this wall feel very cool and very good. Now, an extension of this too is the kind of comparison between Dwarf Warriors now and Chaos Dwarf Warriors. Chaos Dwarf Warriors are a tier 2 unit versus the Dwarf Warriors at tier 1, and they cost 200 more gold. But they have a pretty substantial increase in melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength. That kind of sucks. I know it's 200 gold more. I know it's a tier 2 unit. I get these things. They've got fire resist versus the spell resist of a dwarf warrior, which is arguably a much better stat, and contempt, which we don't know what that does, but contempt in the tabletop helped out with panic tests. So maybe it treats everyone as expendable within a certain radius. I bet you that's kind of how it's going to be factored in. Now, I have no idea what the upkeep is like on them either, but I think that you still have to look at the fact that they have Infernal Guard. And then they also get, Infernal Guard would probably be a hybrid rifle infantry unit, which is more like a Streltsy. They also get the Immortal, like the Dark Iron Immortals or Dark Metal Immortals, the dudes with the really cool masks. So the Chaos Dwarf Warriors already are incomparable with Longbeards. So those Immortals are going to be kind of in line with Ironbreakers probably, if not probably better. I don't know. And I think that's kind of not as cool. You know, and I think that's why the dwarf line needs a little something here, something to give them a little more oomph. Even looking at hammerers, the Peak Gate Guard are really good because they've got Sunder. These guys, not so much. The Peak Gate Guard have immune to psychology, which the hammerers do not. Now I get it's a Regiment of Renown. The Regiment of Renown's got to feel cool, but comparing hammerers to Longbeards, you're looking at a tier 2 versus a tier 3 unit. I get those things, but it's a substantial jump in melee attack and weapon strength. You just kind of feel weird being in a hammerer spot because you also now lost your charge defense versus large. You've lost encourage, but that's part of the Longbeard's profile, so I'm not expecting that. And you lost your immune to psychology, which I kind of think should be on the hammerers by default. So I feel like a lot of the roster, the current roster as is, feels very funky for the dwarfs. The Ballista, or the bolt thrower for that matter, could be made better or at least cheaper so it's more cost effective. These little tiny tweaks to the roster I think could make a large increase on things. Or maybe adding more variants here, right? Better variants for your Iron Breakers, giving them some great weapons, or better variants with your Longbeards, giving them 2 weapons, or adding Skaven Slayers for a Slayer variant that gives me an anti-infantry unit, because these are effectively your cavalry when it comes to not being in the air for dwarfs. They've got a 40 speed. It's the fastest unit in the army aside from, your flyers. So give me an anti-infantry version of these guys. Give me a runesmith who actually replenishes my campaign troops, or another hero that does so. Maybe the Demon Slayer or Dragon Slayer, add those in as lords or heroes to kind of give me that replenishment or something of the sort. I feel like, again, the dwarf infantry is amazing, the missile infantry is amazing, but it could just be made more impactful and more distinctive than it currently is, because it just feels very one-dimensional compared to all these awesome ass mechanics that we're starting to get towards the end of Warhammer 2 and now into Warhammer 3, right? Everything coming out of the Eltharion and Grom the Paunch DLC is bananas cool. And we get that too when we got Thoric Ironbrow and getting the addition of the runes. But the rest of the army didn't really feel like it was able to be pulled up to that state that Thoric brought it with. So now let's talk about some new units to be added. And you really don't need to add a ton here. I'm just thinking really of two main ones. Then we'll talk about two other ones. I think if we take a look at the Crypt Horrors as an example here, they are a monstrous infantry unit with a massive 1500. Give me Runic Guardians, a monstrous infantry automaton that sits behind my dwarf line, has mass of 1500, and it holds the line. Maybe they don't have a crazy melee attack. They have more melee defense and armor, and that's kind of like their shtick, is that they are that kind of defensive bastion for the dwarfs to rally around. And they have AP and anti-infantry if they've got 2 axes, or AP and anti-large. So you have something that, oh, you know what? You're going to crash through with your chariots? Well, Matt, you're going to hit into the Runic Guardians. Runic Guardians are from the Warhammer RPG, so they were never in the actual tabletop in any way, shape, or form that I know of, but they're still a really cool conceptualization of a unit. And another one that's an extension of that would be the Runic Golem. Give me something that's kind of in line here with a Terracotta Sentinel. And I know what you're going to say. We don't need to have a large centerpiece model in every single faction. And I agreed with that statement at one point, but now it's just not the case. Everything coming into Total War Warhammer does have a large centerpiece, except for the dwarfs. They don't have anything that can really go toe-to-toe with something that smashes through their ranks aside from cannons and thunderers, which already suffer from a big issue with the way gunpowder is being done in Warhammer 3 and its bugs right now. 3.0 might fix that, and all this might become moot, but I'm still saying that having a big runic golem that kind of, I don't know, looks like a golem from Ulduar in World of Warcraft, just going toe-to-toe with a Terracotta Sentinel could be amazing. Now, 2 other things that we could see for a roster change are the Shard Dragon, and I brought it up because I think a lot of people thought I was going to bring that up, and I brought it up in the past. The Yoked Carnosaur was kind of a sideways step to that came with the Thoric Ironbrow campaign, and the Yoked Carnosaur has a runic yoke that basically allows them to control the Carnosaur, and that's what a Shard Dragon is. It's yoked, it's controlled, it cannot fly. It's more like a Dread Saurian as far as its general look, a dragon without wings, but that could be an approach if you wanted a single model in the game that's going to go toe-to-toe. I think it kind of breaks the aesthetics, so I'm not as crazy about that idea. And then there's always the Thunder Barge. And the Thunder Barge could be envisioned in so many sick ways. You could have it that's very similar. You have one that's kind of similar here to the way the Sky Junk works, right? With an artillery piece on there. Give it a flame cannon. Give it an organ gun so it's shooting some AP pellets downrange and causing some serious damage. Put a cannon on the damn thing. I don't care. Make a Thunder Barge really sick so that the dwarves have some really awesome, true, non-meme air superiority that really feels punchy in their roster. I mean, that could be your large centerpiece model. It's not a model that's going to go toe-to-toe with a Terracotta Sentinel, but instead it can just shoot apart the Terracotta Sentinel and not be threatened as much unless there's counter range to knock it down. And that, I think, could be a big strength of the dwarf roster. Their centerpiece is hard to destroy because it's in the air, and you need things that are going to be able to knock it out. Give it a large HP pool, a good amount of armor, and I think that could be a lot of fun. And maybe low melee defense because it's a Zeppelin, and you pop those things and you pop them. So a dragon can go rip it down a little bit easier, but I think that kind of play adds some spice to the play style of the dwarfs without kind of making them so one-dimensional. Now, there are a bunch of other things that could be added. Dragon Slayers, Demon Slayers, talked about that a little bit. The Dwarf Goblin Hewer. You've got the Dwarf Slayers that have the spinning axes. That could be your anti-infantry. There's tons of other things that you could do to the roster, but those are just my initial things I wanted to talk about as it pertains to new units added in. And if you have any suggestions for new units for the Dwarf roster, just let it be known in the comment section below. Let's move now into the campaign map. So taking a look at our campaign map, I'm running a number of mods that make the UI look really cool. So I think that's the custom faction UI mod or whatever it is. But we've got your Great Book of Grudges, not to plug the Great Book of Grudges YouTube channel owned by Nathan, a very cool and great man. But you've got this, and it's had some revamps and some changes across the years. It still feels kind of a little one-dimensional, a little lackluster, almost like a fetch quest from like an MMO, almost like World of Warcraft again. You have the Forge with your Oath Gold, and Oath Gold 2 just kind of feels a little flat, especially when you compare this to the Chaos Dwarfs, who have to harvest raw materials for armaments that are then used for X, Y, or Z. It's like, man, the dwarfs just feel like they're, we make things with stuff. And you have to go all the way down here and get your Oath Gold, and you make these runes and all this stuff, and you get your individual trade and stuff like that. Like, okay, kind of cool. Still feels very flat. And that's how you get your Oath Gold: battles, buildings, characters, grudges, missions, and recycling items. I actually don't have an amazing recommendation on how we could change Oath Gold. I don't play the Dwarfs a lot, but I do know that the Oath Gold is very flat, and a lot of people have said, I really wish that it had more complexity to it, or it was a more interesting mechanic. And I'm not one to usually say like, hey, I don't like this thing, and then leave it at that. I usually am very good at proposing things to do to change it, but because I don't want to make it seem like a derivative of another mechanic, I cannot think of a good way to make Oath Gold really fun and interesting and engaging. But there is a really cool mod here that adds caravan routes to the Dwarfs. Now, we've seen that the Chaos Dwarfs have this too, but trade is a really big part of the Dwarf lore, and it's a really big part of how they kind of push themselves into the lore of other factions. Dwarfs are responsible for creating so many big things. Gal Maraz is one of them, right? The hammer that Sigmar used, and now Karl Franz uses. The Rune Fangs, all these things that are very integral to the lore of these other factions. But you don't really have that. So what if Oath Gold or Forges, and it's really cool how this mod does this, it envisions you starting these caravans to increase your diplomatic relation with that faction, and that's exactly what I was going to say is, it'd be cool if you could craft weapons and items as a means of boosting your standing with factions, and have those things actually kind of have a bit of a tail of the tape to them. And that's what makes the Dwarfs so cool, is that they are this removed faction, but also this involved faction. Hey, you know what? We didn't go help and do that big war over there, but we created the armaments that allowed that war to succeed. And that's a really sick thing. One big thing that the Black Library books really go into, I think, it's one of the, I think the book is called Grudge Bearer or something. It's kind of the telling of Thorgrim's coming up. But there's a lot that is done in the underway for the Dwarfs. They patrol the underway. They kind of go and go out into the underway to try to reestablish old parts of the Karazhan. And I think that would be kind of cool, rather than maybe the caravan route, which is at this point, this is straight up a carbon copy of the cafe route, right? That's the mod here. And we have that coming with the Chaos Dwarfs. What if it was discovering the underway as a campaign mechanic to, okay, use the Dwarfs. You're going to start forging through the underway and making new headway into the World's Edge Mountains or other mountain ranges to try to discover previously forgotten portions of the Karazhan. And it's going to give you special engagements or special things that you can do, special battles. You get special items, special tap into things. Maybe, you know what? This is a way that you can get resources for your forge without having to go and solidify furs. Oh man, we found an ancient stash that allows us to harvest marble in this portion of the Karazhan that we have unearthed. And I think that would be really sick. You are pushing through the underway, not in the way that the caravan system is like a point and go, right? You go, okay, I'm going here, I'm sending the caravan and it goes. No, you are expanding this underway tunnel in a direction. And maybe you hit some way where it says, not avalanche, but like you hit the Balrog. No, but like you hit a point where, okay, you got to fight a battle, or you abandon this route of the underway and you have to make a new one. Something that it makes the Dwarfs feel like they are constantly at war with the underway, which is a really big mechanic in the lore. That's how they kind of face a lot of their bigger internal struggles, is fighting in the underway. I mean, that's kind of what happens at the end times. The Skaven go, we're kind of huge. Let's just invade through the underway and kill everything. Deus Ex Machina. But still, I think tapping into the underway, an underused mechanic outside of just doing this, could really make this a really fun mechanic. And maybe the more you push through the underway, it creates a portion of the map that is safer for you to use your underway passage here, right? Like, when you're in that portion of the underway that you've already established, it's harder for you to get ambushed or intercepted or whatever it is. So I think that if you take the existing mechanics, you can tweak them just a little bit to make them just a little more interesting, or to take that underway mechanic and really expand about it and go into a crazy direction. I mean, there's still more dwarf characters we haven't gone into, right? Bugmans to add a healer character to the range, or God, the guy who owns the Thunder Barge in the Gotrek and Felix novels, who I just cannot think of right now, the Slayer engineer, add him in, bring a bunch of Slayer stuff into the game, and that's what you expand this as a massive DLC. I mean, some of these things can be just simply done with an FLC, but I think a lot of what the Dwarfs need, unfortunately, would have to be tacked on with the DLC because it does probably require a development budget to do. So if you have any ideas or any things that you'd like to see change with the Dwarf campaign, go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. Do you really like the Dwarf campaign? You think I'm full of shit? Go ahead and let me know in the comment section below. Nerd Rage Fred jumped on my stream just yesterday and was saying, like, actually, I strongly disagree with you. I think that the campaign is in a really good spot. I really enjoy it, and I only play Legendary. So I take Nerd Rage Fred's opinion of the Dwarfs extremely high because he loves the faction and he plays Legendary more than I do. I'm 2 campaigns of Legendary deep. And I think that the technology tree, my opinion of it is that it's very, very convoluted and messy, but it's still strong. Like, I'm going to go here for more income. I'm going to go here for growth. I'm going to go here for income from iron mines, gold mines, and stone quarries. I'm going to go here for more of that income. So there is a lot of strength, and I'm just going to keep the value train going here. There's a lot of strength in the technology tree, but I think the technology tree is overwhelming and it's just kind of a mess. So I think creating a rhyme or a reason to this, like the way of the guilds, the way of the clans, just rather than it being kind of like these 2 weird disembodied chains, break it into more chains, like 2 or 4, and have them come to the center. Like, okay, here's the way of the guilds, way of the clans, the way of the rune, the way of the forge. I don't know, I'm making them up. And have those things have, okay, these are economic upgrades focused towards individual resources that's in the way of the forge. Okay, these are rune-based and armor-based increases to your army. Way of the clans, these are recruitment cost reductions or recruitment rank increases or melee attack or missile weapon increases to all of your army. Way of the guilds, this is maybe more civic bonuses with growth and stuff like that. Kind of create a rhyme or a reason here rather than this kind of like smash apart, like, hey, go press this button and see how long it takes you to get there. So I feel like that's another big thing with the technology tree and the Dwarf campaigns. It doesn't need to be completely broken apart and fixed. It needs to be just tell a better story. Maybe that's a better way to look at it or whatever it is. But that's my kind of thought here on the Chaos, on the Dwarfs. The Dwarfs are a great faction. And this is coming from someone who's a high elf fanboy and has never really liked Dwarfs. But they are a really cool, badass looking faction. They're really cool little Norse Vikings. And I think now that the Chaos Dwarfs have come into play, we see a faction that has so many cool, in-depth, and rich mechanics that when you look now back at their order-bound cousins, you see a faction that's a little bit flatter. And I don't quite like that. I don't want any faction in the game, even if I don't like them, to feel one-dimensional, flat, or boring. I want all of them to feel rich and diverse and crazy and cool, and I understand that that's going to have to take time and all these things, but I think having the conversation that it needs to be addressed up front is a beginning step to getting it improved. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Go ahead and let me know what you think in the comment section below, but have a good one and take care.